What's up guys, my name is Ace, and today I wanted to take a deep look at the maps in Black Ops 6 and really break down why I feel these maps are not landing very well with the community, and what specific elements of these maps set them apart from the fan favorite maps of the past. Now coincidentally, Nero Cinema just made a video about this, and I just want to point out I've actually been working on this video for a while, and it's just a coincidence that this happens to be coming out a day after Nero, but I did have a skim through his video, and it appears we came to similar conclusions with different approaches. And before we dive into this, I just want to point out, first off, I don't absolutely hate every map that's in Black Ops 6. I think there's some decent maps mixed in there, but overall, I do feel the general map pool at launch has been quite underwhelming, especially for Treyarch. Also, of course, in this game, there are a variety of different maps with their own unique characteristics and also their own unique issues, so I will be making some general statements in this video that won't necessarily apply to every map in the game, or they'll apply to some maps much more than others at least. Also, the approach I'm going to take here is I want to compare this directly to some of the fan favorite maps from the past, like Raid for instance. It turns out if you just focus on how the map looks as you're navigating the lanes, you can see a drastically different design philosophy between fan favorite maps like that and the maps in Black Ops 6. But before we get into that direct comparison, I do want to lay out the biggest general issue I feel with the map design in Black Ops 6, and this is simply their lane structure. While you could argue that most of the maps in Black Ops 6 have a 3-lane structure, you could draw out 3 lanes for them, what I've noticed with many of the maps is there's a lack of clear separation between those 3 lanes. And this means you often see blending between lanes to the point where they don't really feel like really unique, distinct lanes on the map, and therefore often in this game, a 3-lane map will actually play much more like a 2-lane map. And in my eyes at least, 3 lanes tends to be this sweet spot for a game like Call of Duty. It just spreads the 6 players from each team out really nicely. It provides you a variety of options without being totally overwhelming, and I don't think it's a coincidence at all that the majority of fan favorite Call of Duty maps have a 3-lane structure to them. Oftentimes, the 3-lane maps aren't really playing like 3-lane maps, and that's a clear issue on its own. Additionally, something I've noticed with many of the maps, when you select your lane, there are too few options within the lane itself. Like I often find when I select a lane, there's really just one viable choice to approach that lane. There's one solid piece of cover that you can use, or you're forced to push through this one particular area that's just really not a good option. There's too many angles toward that area. But that's the only option that you have once you select that lane. And I do think this can sometimes lead to very repetitive and overly predictable gameplay as well, where every time you approach a lane, there's only really one way you can approach it and one way the enemy can approach it. And therefore it's just that same engagement over and over again every time you approach that lane. Now, of course, there is a fine line here. You don't want to go too far in the other direction and provide way too many options, which can spread players out way too thin, or it creates way too many threat zones for you to have to monitor at any given time because enemies can be in so many different places on your screen at once. I think things do need to be controlled to an extent, but in Black Ops 6, in my experience, they tend to lean a little bit too far in the direction of being overly simplistic when we're specifically referring to engagements within the lane itself. Additionally, kind of going off the point I mentioned earlier, where the lanes aren't necessarily super distinct and they don't have really clear separation, this can often lead to way too many cross angles, or angles that are perpendicular to the map flow. So you're traveling through a lane, obviously trying to be aware of the threats that are in that lane directly in front of you, while simultaneously having to worry about threat zones that have a clear angle on you, like 90 degrees to your left or right. So you can't properly monitor those angles while also monitoring the angles directly in front of you that are generally the more direct threats. And what this means is while navigating through a lane with these cross angles, it often feels like a coin flip. Like you might initially clear that cross angle, then you just have to hope that somebody doesn't end up on that angle as you're pushing across and now monitoring the threats in front of you. Because if they do, then there's really not much you can do about that except try to use the omni movement to your advantage to fight back, while hoping at the same time that from the other angle you don't suddenly have another enemy appear there, and now you're dealing with enemies 90 degrees apart. Let's contrast that with some of the older style Treyarch maps, especially from like Black Ops 2 for instance, and especially focusing on fan favorites like Raid for instance. This is often listed for players as their favorite map in Call of Duty history. It's one of my personal favorite maps in Call of Duty history, and let's actually get into a match and see what it looks like as you're navigating the lanes. So obviously Raid is a 3-lane map, and let's just start with the left lane as we're approaching it here, or the poolside lane. So as we come around this corner, this is where we're going to start to worry about where enemies are. And at this point, you can see how controlled our angles are. The most common places you're going to be running into somebody would be obviously that piece of cover there, up in the window there, and up in the or down in that area there below the building. So that's 3 primary threat zones you have to worry about. And they're all in a very contained area on the center of your screen. I don't have to worry too much about like this window, for instance, more often than not, unless the enemies are really pushed up on us. But that's a different situation from what you would normally experience when approaching this. And then as I'm coming through this, I have various options to use for myself as well. I can come to this rock and use this as cover to challenge these 3 main lanes or 3 main threat zones right here. I could drop down to this part here, also great cover to challenge these 3 main threat zones, while also opening up the ability to look at this threat zone right here, which is important to be aware of as you're pushing up and navigating through. But again, you can see all of these threat zones are contained within the general center of my screen. I don't have to worry about 90 degrees to my left or 90 degrees to my right, aside from, again, that window. But typically, if you're watching your minimap, you can really make sure that your teammates have that kitchen area covered because there's limited options to get into this zone. Then as I'm pushing up, you can still see I'm controlling these angles to these primary threat zones right here, no problem. And I can snap to any of these really, really easily, and I'm not constantly paranoid about my left or right. Now here is where you do get to the cut point toward the middle of the map, and yes, this is where you have to start to worry about that, but as I'm approaching this, you can see now I just have to worry about like directly in front of me right here, maybe a little bit to the left or right, although we should have control of one side of the map, so it's basically left or center right here. That's 2 main threat areas I have to worry about. Now on the flip side, if we're approaching it from the other angle, coming through this way right here, it's a very similar story. We've got the pool hut area, that's 1 main threat zone. We have this threat zone here, this one here, and also the one up there, but these are so close together that that's a really easy snap. And again, you can see all of these are within a fairly small area of my screen. It's easy to snap between them. It's easy to monitor all of the main threat zones that you would have to monitor while pushing up through the map. And as I'm approaching, I can also cut left to cut off that angle to make sure that I'm just opening up these 2 angles right here, or 3 angles, I guess you could call them. And there's different ways to push through here while limiting the lines of sight that various threat zones have to you. Now coming to the other side of the map right here, there are also a limited number of threat zones to worry about. We've got that primary one right there. We have the window, which we can use this statue to really nicely control the angles on. That's a key part as well with these fan favorite maps. They often provide us really nice pieces of cover to cut off key angles as we're approaching in a lane as well, which opens up a lot more creativity within that lane because I can swing wide on this one, use this statue to cut off that threat area right there. So now I really only have to worry about the window and then maybe somebody on the van. And I do have to keep an eye on this area here, but it's not going to be a huge threat zone to worry about typically. And most of my attention is just focused on these primary threat zones. Now I could drop low if I wanted to and cut off even more angles. I could come down to here, head glitch this, and worry about just this and this, with maybe kind of having to worry about that a bit, not having to worry at all about that threat zone over there. And as I'm pushing through here, I'm constantly monitoring my angles and controlling my angles to the various threat zones, while generally keeping all of the threat zones in my screen and toward the center of my screen as well. And it's the same thing coming from the other direction. Obviously, as I'm approaching here, I'm going to want to pay attention to this area here. I can wrap around. Now I've got maybe van up here and this part here, but fairly controlled here. Most of the threat zones are going to be right there, but I'll have to kind of keep an eye out here. Then when we push down to this area, again, we can use this to control our angles from the top window area. So now we can just challenge this guy if we want without having to worry about that guy. We could come over here and just control these angles, so we're only challenging this. We can make it so we're only challenging this. There are so many different options we can use here that gives this lane a whole lot of character, and you're not always just going to run into the exact same engagement over and over and over again. There is a variety of different ways to handle your engagements, while simultaneously maintaining control over your angles. And let's now contrast this with Skyline, which is actually one of my favorite maps currently in Black Ops 6, but I still think it has some issues, and it will highlight some of the key issues with their map design philosophy. And let's approach my favorite lane generally to play, which is the bar side. I think this one plays the best, but we've got a couple different options here once we join this lane, and that is dealing with this area right here. We could wrap around this way, and that's totally fine, controlling that angle and getting to the bar right here, and now you have the clear advantage. But of course, you do have to worry about that cross angle a little bit. You can mitigate that by pushing back a bit here. But this is pretty straightforward, kind of boring. There's not a lot of creativity in this lane. Think about this compared to the lane on Raid that we were just looking at with the statue, where there's lots of room to maneuver and different pieces of cover that you can use to cut off key angles. Here, it's just like, get to the bar And now you have the clear advantage over anybody coming through here, but you do have to worry about this angle to your right quite a bit, actually. Like, that's a pretty high threat thing that you have to worry about. So you're having to constantly check over there or try to control your angles this way and just make sure you're bouncing back and forth between these. This is actually one of the better ways to approach this map from that direction. And then let's just talk about cutting maybe toward the center lane here. That's one of our options that we have available to us. And we can actually cut our lanes off nicely coming through this way. And this is where we run into a situation where we have one option. If we want to continue pushing, we have literally one option on this lane, and that is to come around this corner with no cover and exposing yourself to people coming off spawn through this doorway. So very high traffic zone right here. People could be up here. As you start wrapping around, people could be coming through this area right here. And then the people that are camping on the stairs, if you're not using Ninja, they could hear your footsteps and now they're going to shoot you in the back. Or if you have Ghost, or if you have Ninja and not Ghost, maybe you show up on the radar. Again, they turn around, they shoot you in the back. And if you want to continue approaching this, typically you want to get to the upper area here. You've got a few options. You could jump the piano, and then from the piano, jump up here. You're exposing yourself quite a bit to anybody across the way there. Again, anybody could turn around here and shoot you, or people coming through here. So pretty high risk scenario right there. Another option is to wrap around like this, try to get to the elevator and come up, but obviously you're really exposing your back to anybody coming through here, which is very common, and you'll typically get shot in the back doing that. That's really a big coin flip situation there. Or alternatively, same thing, but coming up the stairs, and you're exposing your back to anybody coming through here. It just feels awful approaching this side of the map, and you don't have really any other options. There's no jump spots to get up here or anything. If you're coming this way, you've got to come around this angle. Now, instead of cutting toward the middle, what if we want to approach from this side? Well, I think this will highlight some issues as well. So as you're approaching here, obviously you want to be worrying about people right here. This is really common. You'll have somebody hanging out there just waiting for you to come around this corner with no cover. So you have to be really worried about that threat zone. And then as you approach this, suddenly we have to worry about a cross angle. And this is a really common cross angle. But you'll notice if I'm checking this cross angle, what's happening over here? I have no idea. I can't possibly cover this and this at the same time, and this can lead to really awkward feeling situations where you're essentially flipping a coin by moving your aim away from that area to focus on this area right here, and at any moment I could be shot from the left now. So you might want to zip through here as quickly as possible and get toward the spawn, but it just feels really awkward and limiting in situations like that because you can't keep your engagements always in front of you like you could on Raid. As you're approaching those lanes on Raid, you could always keep your engagements in a really small area, and that makes it feel like you have so much more control as you're navigating through those lanes. Let's just look at another example here on this map. If we want to push the stair side of the map, obviously we could push out here, but no cover. They have the height advantage there. You could have a guy there, up there. Even on the bar, you could have somebody watching this lane across there, so super dangerous right here. So we could take the stairs, and here you have a nice 50-50 gunfight across the way to anybody over there or on that piece of cover there. Now we have this, which is our one option to get across here from the top portion. And your primary threat zone you want to be focused on is this point here. But as you're pushing through, you really got to worry about everybody over here too. And that's a pretty big snap over to this area. You might even have to worry about people down low here or down in here. And again, you can't really manage all your cross angles here as you're approaching things in the same way that you could on Raid, for instance. Another great example, pushing up toward this choke point right here from the other side of the map. You got to worry about people coming through this area here. You got to worry about people on the bar or even in front of the bar here that could potentially get to you. As you're pushing through here, you got to worry about here, over here, up here. And again, you can't possibly be controlling all of these threat areas at once while navigating through this lane. You're going to have to flip a coin. You're going to have to just try to zip through there with your on movement, knowing that you're probably going to take some damage at the very least. Some people are going to hit you. And it just feels like a really uncontrolled experience where you're just flying out in the open and hoping for the best in many scenarios. Now, it turns out Skyline was actually one of the more tame options. And again, I actually quite like Skyline for this game. Let's have a look at Lowtown. And I know you guys know what I'm going to be looking at here. That is the center area or the B domination area on Lowtown. This is awful. I absolutely hate this area of the map. And this is why I don't like playing domination on this map. I think some of the other areas of the map actually can play quite well, but not this area right here. So if I want to come capture the B flag and I'm coming through this area here, just think about all the threat zones I have to worry about. Over here, over here, over here, over here, and up here. How can I possibly manage even half of those threat zones at any given time? You can't. It's just not viable. It's not possible to do that. and this little piece of cover is not going to give you a whole lot of options to work around and play around with. Same thing if we're approaching from the doorway right here. We've got somebody that has a height advantage over you while you have no cover. Have somebody over here that could be head glitching, people in the window here, this door here, this door here. You just can't realistically manage your angles at all while playing through this area, and that just makes this a dead zone. I just don't play in this area if I can avoid it, and you can't avoid it in domination if you're trying to win, so really frustrating trying to play in this area right here. And it's not just that area as well. Like, that's obviously the biggest problem area, but even on this more defined lane over here, let's see what this looks like when it comes to our threat zones and where we have to monitor. So we'd have to monitor over here, here, possibly on the boat area, and more importantly, up here at the same time. How do I monitor this and this while also monitoring this? Like, you can't really realistically do that. You can kind of be here and try to snap to target and watch all of this, but compare that to Raid, where you almost always had your threat zones in front of you. You had good, viable options to control your angles and control your cover placement between you and the key threat zones. And I think that's one of the reasons that Raid plays so well, and it's a fan favorite in this game, compared to many of the Black Ops 6 maps where it just feels like no matter what you do, you can never properly control all of the angles that you need to be able to control while approaching a lane. Now, one final map I wanted to pick on here with Black Ops 6 is Derelict. And these are just a few examples. I'm not saying these are the only problem areas or problem maps. These are just a few really easy examples I could pull out. But a big thing I noticed with Derelict is the lack of cover options as you're trying to approach the mid-map area. No matter which lane you choose, I just feel like you're constantly exposing yourself to some areas. Now, at least here, like, you could control your angles a little bit. You can keep everybody generally in front of you, but then as you're pushing up here, now you have this cross angle over here to that area right over there. You have to worry about this, and you're going to have to worry about people potentially coming around and flanking you on this area here, which is way more than 90 degrees over from where you're looking in this way. So really difficult to control angles there. Also, just the options that you have. Let's say I'm approaching the left side right here. I have two options. This right here, where I have no cover, they're pre-aiming this already, they're going to be able to shoot me. Or I have this option here with my really slow high mantle, really exposing myself here, but I might be able to at least take them off guard for a brief moment and get the jump on them. Now I end up in this situation here, and again, I have a basically A-B option. I can go this way or this way while staying in this lane, but then I have to worry about cross angles from people that are in the middle lane. Then what about approaching from this side of the map? Well, as I'm coming through here, I have to worry about a cross angle from the middle lane right here. I can at least cut off the angle from the top area, so that's nice, but up there is a pretty common area too to worry about. Then as I'm coming around here, I have no cover. There's no cover placement here at all to match this piece of cover right here, where you're almost always going to have somebody just chilling there, since it is a very powerful position. So now I'm in a disadvantage trying to handle this gunfight. Well, also, even if I do get pushed up here, now I have to worry about the cross angles from back over here. So I'm dealing with a high risk fight here while also having all these high threat zones behind me. And it's just impossible to be managing all of this at any given time as a solo player. Now, obviously, you could argue, well, you're supposed to be playing this as a team. But at the end of the day, things happen really quickly, and that's just often not how Call of Duty tends to be played, is like carefully coordinating with your team and making sure like, oh, your one teammate has this angle covered, so you push this angle. As soon as you start relying on your teammates to cover angles, that's when you're going to have a bad time in Call of Duty. You need to be able to manage your surroundings appropriately by yourself, at least to a degree. And with most of the maps in Black Ops 6, and in many situations on these maps in Black Ops 6, you just can't realistically do that. And it's a really night and day difference with this map design philosophy compared to what we used to have back in the day with many of our fan favorite maps. And I hope that was a good explanation with some good examples there to show why that map design philosophy just feels so different. However, there is one other key element to consider here. When we're talking about map design, it always goes hand in hand with spawns. And I do think that's another part of the issue in Black Ops 6. And thankfully, that's the type of thing that can be adjusted and drastic improvements could be made there. And I honestly really don't think we even need drastic improvements to spawns, just some more tweaks and tuning. In my opinion, at least, for domination, while I do like the fact that the spawns are more on the sticky side than the flippy side, you don't want spawns flipping all over the place so map control doesn't exist. At the end of the day, I do think they've taken that a little too far in domination, and the spawns are too sticky. They're not flipping when like the entire team is pushed up in a full-on hardcore spawn trap that they just can't break out of. There's no chance for them to get out of there. At that point, yeah, the spawns should be flipping, and many times they're not. And this can actually lead to a lot of boring situations if you're on the winning team as well, because you're basically just shooting fish in a barrel since they don't have any viable options to break out of their spawn. So I definitely don't want to see them totally flip this to the other direction for domination, but perhaps making the spawns just a little bit flippier on average would go a long way for Dom. But what about the team deathmatch style spawn? So TDM, kill confirmed, and other modes like that. Well, it's kind of funny. In these modes, I think they took it too far in the other direction and the spawns are flipping too much. And this leads to a lack of feeling of map control. There's a lack of clearly defined flow as well. Oftentimes I feel like I'm aimlessly wandering around the maps in team deathmatch, just trying to find out where an enemy might be coming from, and knowing that an enemy could pop up basically from anywhere at any time because the spawns are flipping all over the place so much that you can't really keep track of them. Additionally, when the spawns are flipping so much, when you are on the more dominant team, it can be really boring and frustrating just running back and forth. You run to one side of the map, you get a kill or two, then the spawn has already flipped, so you turn around, run to the other side of the map, get a kill or two, and it flips back. So I think there's a happy middle ground to be found when it comes to both domination as well as a TDM style spawns, and we're just not quite there yet with Black Ops 6. Like I said, I don't think we need like a full-on spawn overhaul or anything in this game. Just some tweaks and tuning I think would go a long way, and it would actually make the maps feel and play better than they currently do. Now, of course, these are all just my opinions, and I'm sure I'm just scratching the surface of some of the map problems as well. I think there are a lot of other things that you could point to when it comes to issues with the maps, but I think those primary issues are the lack of really defined 3-lane design, where once you pick a lane, you're really in that lane, and you primarily only have to deal with threats that are in that lane as well, which leads to the next issue, which is an overabundance of cross angles between lanes, so you're constantly having to worry about multiple angles that are often outside of your field of view, which can lead to a feeling of a lack of control while playing on the maps. And also, I think creativity within each lane is lacking on many of the maps and in many of the lanes on the maps. Now, of course, these are all just my opinions though, and I'd love to hear from you guys in those comments down below. First off, how are you guys feeling about the maps in general in Black Ops 6? Do you guys like the maps, hate the maps, somewhere in the middle? And also, do you agree with the assessment I made here? Do you think these are some of the bigger issues with the maps? Or do you think the issues are due to something else entirely? Just let me know down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated. And don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.